Hi, everybody. Welcome to yet another one of our World War II Homefront webinars. This one is on Native American and Indigenous World War II Homefront history. I'm Matt Basso. This is a re-recording because our initial recording, we had some technical difficulties. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. But first, I want to thank the National Council for Public History and the National Park Service for their continued support of not just the webinar series, but this larger World War II Homefront initiative. My research team at the University of Utah also deserves big thanks, both the undergraduate and graduate students, but a special shout out to Nick Backman, who was going to be presenting this with me today, but is not feeling well. In each of these webinars, I've briefly acknowledged the scholars whose work these chapters are built upon. I want to once again underline my thanks and note that their work is fully cited in the long chapter that is part of the Volume 2 theme study that will be released by the National Park Service about the World War II Homefront by the end of 2024 or the beginning of 2025. There's really been excellent scholarship, especially by Indigenous scholars, and I want to, I want to lift them up, and their work is deeply appreciated, and I hope I do justice to it. On the screen, you see a picture of several Marine Corps women reservists, Native American women who are at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina in 1943. You're also seeing on your screen a picture of me. I'm a middle-aged white man with a goatee, and I'm speaking to you from Salt Lake City, Utah. These women remind us of the deep importance of both military service to the World War II Homefront story, for Native American people and Indigenous people, but also of the overall importance of militarization to the Homefront story. That's a theme that I've mentioned several times throughout these webinars, and that is picked up significantly in our theme study, especially in the environmental history chapter, but also the Native American Indigenous chapter. I've just switched slides, and here I've got a photograph from Indians at Work, a really fascinating publication by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that appeared during World War II. That's publicly available, and a quick Google will take you to Indians at Work. In 1940, the Native American population in the United States stood at just over 345,000, at least by census takers. That was a dramatic increase from the 237,196 that are enumerated in the 1900 census, which is the year that the Native American population had reached its low point. In the 1930s, John Collier and the Indian New Deal became headline stories for scholars who see this as a significant moment, understandably, in a story of transformation. This is, of course, the Collier story that deals with assimilation and a new approach to Native American culture that, in theory, sidebars ideas around assimilation. This chapter is going to pick up those questions, and this presentation is as well, but I want to argue that the war proved to be at least as critical a turning point for Native Americans. To tell that story, I've noted on this slide here, which says roadmap, that we're going to talk about some historical fundamentals, including historiographical fundamentals. We're going to talk about race or nation as organizing concepts for World War II Homefront Native American history, as well as the larger history of Native America, military service and resistance to military service. And then we're going to concentrate for a significant amount of time in the urbanization of Native American civilians because of war work, urban Native American organizations in cities, and the place of boarding schools and war production work in drawing Native American folks and Indigenous folks into cities. talk about reservation land, especially agriculture, but also resource extraction and wartime land loss. And then I will concentrate for a considerable period of time on US territories and militarization of indigenous lands, particularly in Hawaii, Guam, and Alaska. I should note that the theme study again expands on these topics considerably more than I'm able to do in this webinar. We will conclude with post-war challenges and opportunities. World War II did indeed offer new opportunities for many Native American, Alaska Native, and Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders to chart their own path. Much as some Indian leaders believed it would, but for others, it's worth noting that, like those in the US territories, which were as much front lines as home fronts, the war represented constrained possibilities. For all Native and Indigenous people, paternalism continued and demands, both implicit and explicit, for assimilation increased, especially as Native people interacted more with white folks in the military and in war production. What the scholar Vishwana Goman has called economies of dispossession thus characterize Native nations' history, not just under settler colonialism, but for World War II, but also this idea of economies of dispossession emerged powerfully again during the war. At least 25,000 Native Americans, that's Kanaka Maoli, Native Alaskans, and folks from tribes in the lower United States joined the military, and more than 40,000 others migrated to urban areas to work as riveters, chemists, truck drivers, sheet metal cutters, and in myriad other war production jobs. Others, especially women, stayed on or near their home reservations and did critical agricultural work to feed US civilians, soldiers, and American allies. Native nations were asked to give up 840,000 acres of tribal lands for military use. The Pine Ridge Indian Reservation was hit especially hard, losing 300,000 acres. Individual landowners, the BIA, and tribal governments approved 3,500 oil and gas leases to add to this use of native land during the war. Individuals from an impressive number of tribes bought some $50 million in war bonds. More planted victory gardens, participated in scrap drives. All of this is part of the story of the World War II home front. To tell this story, again, I want to direct you to the roadmap and to the key themes that are expanded on more in the full chapter that this webinar encapsulates. So fundamental to the story of Native American experience during World War II, and of course prior, are questions around race or nation, questions around sovereignty and treaties and the relationship with US governments, and the question of tribal members' citizenship in Native nations and the United States. The photograph on this slide shows a group of Native American leaders in Washington, D.C., and we should make sure to remember that for many Native Americans, they did not receive citizenship until 1924. In communities around the Western United States where Native people were the predominant non-white population, segregation, dramatic inequality of opportunity, and violence were common before 1924 and after, even after the Indian Citizenship Act. In other parts of the country, government officials' racialization of Native peoples was more convoluted in the West, when in places like Bismarck, North Dakota, white citizens during the war treated German and Italian POWs better than they did Native Americans. In these other parts of the country, Virginia, for example, these convoluted systems of racialization were equally troubling. The Registrar of Vital Statistics for Virginia, who, like many white Americans, saw race in terms of the dominant binary of Black and white, would not allow Native Americans to be classified as anything other than Black. Nonetheless, Native Americans served in desegregated units, but Native soldiers were racialized in the media, in their integrated units, and on the front lines. Indians, as they were often termed, that is to say that many non-Indians bought into the stereotype of Indianness that was circulated through dime novels, radio serials, and movies. This was a notion that Native Americans had a special warrior spirit. White officers assigned Native soldiers tasks such as rock climbing that supposedly conformed to their natural capabilities. Some Native Americans in and out of uniform responded to racism and stereotypes on the home front by arguing they were uniquely American, a narrative that Native leaders, especially in cities, had used in the decades before the war. Historian Paul Rozier's research shows that this rhetoric allowed them, Native leaders, to claim racial and civic nationalism, as well as ordinary Native folks, and to use patriotism to mediate between these positions during the war. This led to, especially in cities, the stronger development of a pan-Indian identity on the home front. I've already noted the number of Native folks who served in the military, but this slide underscores that point by focusing on military service. 25,000 Native Americans at least served in World War II. Code talkers are the featured population of this story. I've noted that many Native folks were stereotyped in uniform, and that there really is a story of unequal impact on Native populations regarding their wartime contributions. Before the war, Native service in the military was a significant theme for Native leaders. Native leaders like Chicago-based OIA placement officer Scott Henry Peters, an Ojibwa man, reminded Chicago's elite, where he lived, about the tendency of whites to describe Native Americans who were defending their land and families as murderers, while hailing settler soldiers who attacked natives as virtuous warriors. The term patriot is reserved for white men. Native Americans, he alluded, are only thought of as savages. He told white leaders to correct these accounts, quote, "Put in your history books the Indian part in the World War," and here he was referencing World War I. "Tell how the Indians fought," he added, "for a country of which he was not a citizen, for a flag to which he had no claim, and for a people that have treated him unjustly." Peters wanted the next generation of whites to have a different perspective. Let your white children see that the Indian was a man, that he is capable of thought and feelings. This gendered ideology around manhood is picked up a little bit more in the theme study as well. The contributions of the 25,000 men and women who entered the U.S. Armed Services are, of course, the best known part of the Native American history of the World War II, as I've noted before. The code talkers, though mainly associated with Diné, were also Ojibwe, Crow, and soldiers from at least 12 other Native nations who used their tribal language to defeat Axis code-breaking efforts and to communicate in a way that enemies could not understand. The off-cited willingness of Native American men to fight for the United States flattens the complexities of Native military service, though is important nonetheless to remember. Native Americans, Native Alaskans, and Native Hawaiians volunteered and were drafted. A significant number of men who wanted to serve, however, were blocked by evaluators because of their supposed inability to meet health and education standards. As historian Robert Townsend notes, while only 12% of Arizona's white males were blocked, 23% of Native men were blocked, and sometimes larger numbers too. Again, I tell this story more in the theme study with some specific case studies investigated. Code talkers deserve, of course, all the celebrated accounts that they've received. But what we're trying to emphasize is the importance of seeing this wider breadth of Native American military experience for men and women and tying it to the home front. Likewise, while we want to emphasize military service, it's important to also note the story of resistance to military service. In parallel to large numbers of Native men and women enlisting, several tribes, because of their spiritual beliefs and because of their beliefs in sovereignty, resisted the demand that they enter the draft. For Native nations that were told to follow the dictates of selective service, those that opposed this said it was a challenge to their sovereignty. Leaders like Pia Machita, chief of the Tohono O'odham, showed the importance he placed in tribal sovereignty when he refused both the Arizona Livestock Sanitation Board's entry to Tohono O'odham lands and urged tribal members not to answer questions posed by federal census takers. He also did the same when federal officials arrived to enforce draft registration. And he suffered the penalties associated with evasion. Pia Machita's resistance, both his and that of other tribal leaders, led to arrest, trial, and conviction, and ultimately imprisonment for resisting selective service. I want to again reinforce that other tribes did the same. This challenges the stereotypes, but is an important part of telling the fuller story of Native sense of self and of sovereignty on the World War II home front. Okay, I want to shift now to urbanization and war work. There is, of course, a long history of Native people in urban spaces. The possibilities of war work and better economic conditions dramatically magnified this possibility for Native folks and led to a significant migration to urban spaces from reservation communities. This was an especially influential home front development. So while Native people worked in cities during the home front period, it's important to note they also recreated or passed through or were based near those cities as well. Native civilians that moved to cities for well-paid war production work not only survived in those cities, but in some instances thrived. Critically, they retained the ways and beliefs of their nations and bolstered, as I've noted earlier, an emerging pan-Indian identity. Wartime urbanization also foreshadowed and gave Native people strategies to survive the government's post-war termination policies, which were used to assimilate and sometimes to commit acts of cultural genocide by the government. That is to say that cities were at the heart of that project. I've noted the constant presence of Native people in cities, both before European contact when they developed those cities and afterwards. But for some tribes, it was the war conditions themselves, not just economic possibility, but new labor patterns that pushed their members towards cities. So for California's Round Valley Indians and many other tribes who were migrant agricultural workers, the employment of braceros allowed white farmers to pay lower wages, and these braceros in some instances took Native American jobs, pushing Native folks towards cities. So the possibility, though, of working in cities was an uneven experience based off of gender. So Norman Knight, a Round Valley member, summarized what many Native people thought about going into the war. They wanted more money and education and to be able to fend for themselves. But Native women in particular found this to be difficult as they often struggled to gain well-paying work and were not just the last hired, but were among those that were the first fired. Those that did succeed, men and women, in going into wartime work, usually started in cities closest to their reservation communities. Most of the men, for instance, who left the Bad River Chippewa Reservation headed to the Walter Butler Shipyard in nearby Superior, Wisconsin. Other Native folks around Minnesota tended to go to Minneapolis and St. Paul first. But other Native folks found some rural work that was well-paying. Often this was indeed war production work. So those Hopi and Diné people who were able to get jobs, who were among the 8,000 workers who were able to get jobs at the Navajo Ordnance Depot, a $30 million project in Belmont, Arizona, were among this particular part of the Native American wartime production dynamics that we talk about much more in the chapter. That facility, I should note, was ultimately named after Navajo people by the federal government in honor of their effort to help out with this important part of home front production. I want to focus in, though, on Los Angeles as a key case study for wartime employment. So like Chicago, Minneapolis, and several other cities, Los Angeles was home not just during the war, but prior to the war, to Native American organizations that served as a cornerstone of the development of a wartime community. Among the most prominent in Los Angeles was the Lawanza Teepee that Mira Fry Bartlett, a Kickapoo from Oklahoma, founded in 1935. Bartlett soon changed the name to the Los Angeles Indian Center. LAIC was housed in a building on the west side of downtown and remained significant as an institution for decades. What started as a place to socialize became much more during the war, as thousands of Native workers came to wartime Los Angeles for well-paying jobs and found them in shipbuilding, aircraft manufacturing, machining, ordnance, as I've already noted, aluminum work, rubber, and at military facilities. These groups established the presence of Native people in earliest 20th century cities. And again, I just want to really underscore that they provided Indian migrants ways of being Indian in what on a day-to-day basis was an overwhelmingly non-Indian and sometimes racially hostile environment, as Nick Rosenthal, one of the scholars who's written about this, has written. In other words, these early 20th century Native American organizations contributed to the reimagining of Indian country as a new urban, as partially a new urban kind of space. Their presence was critical to many Native people, but it's also important to note other both magnets and shapers of Native American experience while saying this: the majority of Native people found their way themselves or through their own networks to cities during World War II to do wartime work. I do want to mention the boarding schools because their story is so important to assimilation and genocidal efforts by white society. Boarding schools during the war were very much part of an assimilationist project, but they were also part of an industrializing effort that saw Native people go into war production work. Boarding schools, the best known conduit, arguably, of settler colonialism in places like Los Angeles, sought out Native folks from both the California area and the states around California. The Sherman Boarding School, for example, pictured on the slide that you're looking at now, advertised all over the Southwest to have Native people come to Sherman and learn wartime production work skills. Here, there's also a wonderful image of a student learning to assemble an engine at the Sherman Institute on the photograph. Douglas Miller's research has found that, quote, 6 of the nation's leading Indian vocational schools introduced war industry training programs that by 1942 had already placed 2,500 graduates in national aircraft, tank, and shipbuilding factories. The Sherman Institute, already noted, established in 1902 by the Office of Indian Affairs in Riverside, California, taught young men initially these industrial arts during the war and quickly shifted to teaching Native American women the same skills. Douglas Aircraft was one of the local firms impressed by Native workers. They featured 4 Sherman students in a November 1941 magazine article. Aircraft production companies, other aircraft companies, production companies urged the school to recruit more men and women, but especially women, as men were lost to conscription. Native women workers, we don't know their full numbers, but one source holds that the Richmond, California rail yards employed 3,500 Native women, including in a variety of skilled positions. Another statistic that 46% of Southern California tribal citizens who did war work in Riverside, Los Angeles, San Diego, Escondido, and Palm Springs were women also suggests the overall participation levels were high for Native women that were able to access this work. Again, many in more rural settings were not able to access this work. For many, the story, though, would end up being familiar, even as they succeeded remarkably well in these wartime plants. They were among the first fired when white men started coming back from the war fronts seeking post-war and late war labor. While Native folks who went into cities for wartime work are an absolutely critical part of the Homefront story, and the same goes for Native folks who went into the military, the Homefront was very much also a story about what happened to reservation communities, both on the agricultural front and for resource extraction and land loss. I've already noted the Navajo Ordnance Depot as a case study that was somewhat near the Navajo Reservation as a magnet pulling people away from reservation communities. But agriculture is another part of this story, already a significant industry for some tribes, and remained a cornerstone of the land-based economy during the war. Many new opportunities also opened here for Native women. For instance, at the eastern band of the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina, 79 young women took over in the fields from more than 100 young men who left for military service. They drove tractors, repaired equipment. Another 100 women sewed for the Red Cross. And besides producing farm produce and sewing, the Eastern Band sent considerable timber production to war industries. And the military used tribal funds to purchase, and to the military, and the tribe used their own funds to purchase over $150,000 in war bonds. As in other periods in U.S. history, the federal government often did not inquire about or ignored the views of Native people regarding what was best for them and for their land. Patriotism led some tribal members to support using their lands for defense and war production, but others did not support this and again were ignored. In all cases, a fundamental asymmetrical power relationship structured the way that the federal government and state governments dealt with tribes. The BIA assisted in securing the 3,500 oil and gas leases on Native land that I noted earlier. 4 new oil fields brought into production on the Wind River Reservation could, of course, be justified as patriotic contributions and as critical to Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho survival. These Wind River oil exports went from 615,000 barrels in 1941 to 2.5 million barrels in 1945, second only to the Blackfeet Nation. The Navajo Reservation, when government experts argued that extractive industrialism, mining, and drilling was critical to the health and well-being of the tribe, they ignored any sort of opposition to that idea. While this resource extraction might have helped the tribal family members put food on the table, the health impacts of uranium mining were horrific, as the environmental history chapter and this chapter of the theme study note in further detail. So these efforts at taking tribal resources are part of the longer story, of course, but need to be seen in nuanced ways, as I've just noted. Here's photos that I've mentioned earlier of the Navajo Ordnance Depot, a really important story that, again, I elaborate on in the theme study. I've alluded to land loss during the war. These economies of dispossession are perhaps best represented by the construction of Japanese American incarceration camps at the Gila River War Relocation Center, which was home to the Pima and Maricopa Nations, and also the Colorado River Relocation Center, often called Poston. But according to Darcy McNichol, the effort to take Indigenous land during the war most certainly did not stop with these incarceration camps that were put on Native land and that have been written about fairly extensively. They were also part of the larger effort by the Army Corps of Engineers and its partners to treat Native nations as private landowners, and therefore to subject them to eminent domain rather than to treat them as sovereign nations, which is what they actually were, and to abide by the treaty policies of those nations. This was profoundly consequential, as McNichol notes. He argued that the process in time could only lead to the extinction of Indian people, that is, the use of eminent domain for the acquisition of native lands for airfields and Army and Navy bases and other federal facilities, which covered large parts of territory in the West, the South, the Midwest, and the Southwest, as well as the U.S. territories. More on that in a moment. First, let me note the Army Corps of Engineers taking of native land with the Bureau of Reclamation in the Pick-Sloan Plan, a Missouri River plan, which absolutely decimated, as the scholar Nick Estes notes, the people of the Lakota and Dakota communities in that area to achieve the goals of the plan, which were to irrigate and provide water and land to settlers in the post-war in the Missouri River area. The Bureau of Reclamation took nearly 600,000 acres in North and South Dakota. More than half of that acreage belonged to 7 Lakota and Dakota communities. In an assessment of this, the historian Vine Deloria said it was, quote, without a doubt, the single most destructive act ever perpetrated by any tribe, on any tribe by the United States. Land loss was not just in the continental United States, it was most certainly in Hawaii, Guam, and Alaska. The treatment of land in these places was equally, if not especially, troubling. In Hawaii, for example, the ancestral territory of Kanaka Maoli became what was arguably the most militarized site in the United States. More than 1 million soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and more production workers descended on what was Kanaka Maoli ancestral land. The military occupation of Hawaiian land increased almost 20-fold. This is the formal occupation between 1940 and 1945, going from 35,750 acres to over 645,000 acres. Citing martial law, the military turned, for instance, the island of Kaho'olawe into an artillery and bombing range and training ground immediately after Pearl Harbor, which offers a particularly poignant example of the militarization of Kanaka Maoli land. Kanaka Maoli, called Kaho'olawe, heaven come down to earth, and associated the island with training master navigators whose abilities represented the links between Hawaii and the rest of Oceania, and Kanaka Maoli ties to the ocean ecosystem, including sacred aspects of that ecosystem. The military claimed they would remove all unexploded ordnance and return Kaho'olawe after the war, but they chose not to. I say more about this in the chapter, and I also say more about Native Hawaiian efforts to assist the U.S. military, including laymakers who are pictured here on this slide next to a picture of the bombing of the island. Laymakers helped the military make camouflage. It's important to note, though, that this was also an economic response to militarization. That is to say, the wages were necessary for their survival. I want to move on and talk about Guam. It offers an example of why Pacific Islanders call World War II the Big Death or the Typhoon of War, and illustrates the power dynamics around using indigenous land for military bases. Roughly half of Guam's Chamorro population was forced to march to Manegnan, one of the camps that the Japanese used to incarcerate Chamorro during the war after they took the island from the U.S. military. That site is now a National Historic Landmark. When the U.S. military returned, they made Guam a cornerstone of their strategic presence in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. I want to note that another webinar in this series speaks much more powerfully and evocatively about these stories, but that it's critical to say that 1,300 Chamorro families had their land seized as the military expansion on Guam increased dramatically, and that this parallels similar actions in American Samoa. Military leaders and federal leaders saw the Chamorro as simple, uneducated people. This forms of racism facilitated the taking of these lands and the military occupation of Guam. Again, much more about this in the chapter. Finally, I want to shift our attention to Alaska. Alaska Native people provide a pointed example of the comparative treatment of indigenous and white residents on what was, in fact, Alaska Native property. Alaska was very much part of a defensive zone, and this allowed the military, facilitated the military's yet again poor treatment of Alaska Native folks. But there's a longer history to this. Alaska Native folks were very much part of a Jim Crow attitude that very much enveloped Alaska before the war and during the war. The military, as we note in the chapter, was a big part of this. As part of the Aleutian campaign, the government relocated 881 Unangan residents from 9 villages, ostensibly to protect them from the Japanese who had bombed Unalaska in 1942. But if their evacuation was entirely about safety, as the military claimed, it doesn't explain why white residents, some at least, were allowed to remain. These Alaska Native folks were relocated to pretty horrific conditions in civilian conservation camps at Ward Lake and in dilapidated canneries as well. They were forcibly separated from their children. Approximately 100 Unangan died from the inhumane conditions at these camps. This horrific story is a critical part of Alaska Native history during the war and is told particularly well by Holly Geis in her new book, which I can't recommend strongly enough. Geis also describes what happened during this period as a federal project of total assimilation through cultural genocide. The laws put in place in in Alaska before the war reified white supremacy and Alaska Natives' second-class status. Yet, it's critical to note that ordinary Alaska Natives and leaders fought back against this and fought back against discrimination and resisted it in really remarkable ways. In 1944, a young Inupiaq woman, Alberta Schenck, for example, refused to give up her seat in the white-only section of Nome's segregated Dream Theater. This is a very important story that facilitated and inspired many other Alaska Natives to resist white supremacy on the home front. Perhaps best known is the story of Elizabeth Peratrovich, a Tlingit Ani woman who further exemplifies the fight for Native rights. At the beginning of World War II, she and her husband, Roy, also an activist, moved and a member of the Tlingit Nation, moved to Juneau. And by 1945, they had made considerable strides in getting the Alaska state government, territory government, to put forward a civil rights bill, a bill that was very much opposed by some white supremacists in the state. Peratrovich, in a famous speech, argued against white supremacy, called out white supremacy, and to the applause of many Native Alaskan folks who filled the territorial building and some white allies as well, she rebutted these ideas, which led to the passing of a critical piece of civil rights legislation that laid the groundwork for other legislation by Native folks, not just in the United States, but elsewhere as well. This story then is an ideal place to talk about the post-war challenges which continued for Native folks. Here again, we're talking about segregated situations in both communities on the home front and in workplaces, but the fight against that as well, and perhaps most importantly, the effort by the US government to terminate tribal sovereignty, which is just a critical part of the post-war story. I say much more about this in the chapter, the Native American Indigenous chapter of the theme study, and I want to conclude by urging you, if you have the time, to take a look at that document, and most especially by urging you to see the connections between the home front and the history that occurred before it and after, including perhaps equally critically for sure, the history to defend sacred lands by Native American activists all over Turtle Island. Thank you so much for your attention to this important history, and I'm hoping that it will help inspire the appropriate recognition of sites and properties across Turtle Island that tie to this critical homefront story. With that, I will end. Thank you.